All right, welcome to what I guess is the final video of the class. What we're going to be talking about today is three related but different types of market failures called asymmetric information, adverse selection, and moral hazard. There's not any math in this lecture, but this is actually a pretty hard topic, okay? We'll start off pretty easy talking about asymmetric information, but then the nuance is actually quite challenging as we compare and contrast these different types of market failures. So asymmetric information, pretty simple idea. This is when one party in a transaction has more information than another party. And asymmetric information is a really common thing if you think about it. When there's a producer selling an item to a consumer, a lot of times one party has more information than the other party. In some cases this is a big deal, in some cases this is not such a big deal, okay? So for example, food quality, we might think about asymmetric information here. If you're visiting another town and you don't know whether a restaurant is good or not, there's obvious asymmetric information. The people producing the food know more about the quality of the food than the potential consumers, especially if a lot of those consumers are coming from out of town, okay? So the result is you have asymmetric information, but in this case, you probably have some free market fixes. So the free market fix is things like Yelp, where you can look up food reviews. And it's not perfect, but the asymmetric information has a way of fixing itself to some extent. On the contrary, you might run into some more problematic versions of asymmetric information, such as health insurance. There's a lot of health insurance asymmetric informations occurring. One is in regards to the producers knowing more than the consumers. So you probably have health insurance, and I bet you're kind of confused about how it works. Most consumers are. I teach health insurance and personal finance, and I'm still somewhat confused about how my policies work. So the producers know more about their policies than the consumers do. All right, that's asymmetric information, but the argument might be that, well, the consumers can learn more if they want to, right, if they try. But that's not the real problematic form of asymmetric information. As you'll see in health insurance, a bigger problem is that the consumers, the purchasers of health insurance, tend to know a lot more about their own health and their own risk tolerances than the providers of health insurance do. And as you'll see, this creates some pretty significant problems. So, when you have asymmetric information, which in and of itself is a bit of a problem, but when you have asymmetric information, there are two possible outcomes. And to be clear, these are only possible outcomes. In some cases, these outcomes don't occur at all. In some cases, one occurs, and in some cases, both occur. And that's where the challenge of the nuance really comes in, where you have to clearly understand the differences between these topics. So two possible outcomes. One of these is something called adverse selection. Okay? Adverse selection. Kind of hard to define, but I'm going to do my best. This is when one party in a transaction is self-selected. Got to make sure I explain this. This is when one party in a transaction is self-selected in a way that harms the other party. So in a way, it's like the producers are taking advantage of the consumers, or the consumers are taking advantage of the producers. And here's the deal. It's not about changing people's behavior. It's about the type of people who decide to be involved, okay? Adverse selection is not about how people change. It's about who decides to be a customer or a producer. So getting back to the health insurance example. Let's say that I'm going to provide as a producer, I'm going to provide a really strong form of health insurance. All right, In this health insurance, the premiums, how much you're going to pay, are going to be really expensive. Let's say they're going to be $300 a month, which is pretty expensive for health insurance. And let's say that the coverage is total. Covers all medical expenses. Okay? Let's think about who would want to purchase this health insurance. Okay? So ask yourself, if this was offered by a company, and anyone could buy it, what type of customer would want to buy this health insurance? What type of person has the most to gain from purchasing this health insurance? Well, it's the ones that will use it, right? The way medical insurance works is, well, let's keep it simple like this one where you're covering all the expenses. The way this would work is if I'm a consumer and I have this insurance, every time I go to the doctor, my company would pay for it. So the company would bear the cost, the health insurance company. Okay? So if I'm somebody who's sick a lot, I'm going to want this insurance. This is a good deal to someone who knows they're going to need a lot of medical expenses. Okay? So the type of person you're going to get here are the people that are sick, old, risk takers, and that's where the adverse selection comes in. All right? You might also tend to get people that are higher income, that maybe more stable, have a family. That's not really adverse selection, right? So it's probably a good thing to get people who have families and have high incomes. But here's the adverse selection. The exact worst people that you would want as a health insurance company are the exact people who have the most to gain. So your consumers are the worst people, okay? So getting back to the definition here, when one party in a transaction is self-selected in a way that harms the other party, this is kind of the key term there, self-selected. When we use this term in economics, what we mean is the people who choose to be involved, who select to be involved, in this case are going to be the worst customers for the producers. All right, so that's adverse selection. And basically any form of insurance you can think of is going to have this problem. So a second example here, imagine if I offered grade insurance. Basically what I'm going to do is if you get less than a 60 on the exam in my classes, I'm going to just give you a C in the class. All right. So if you get less than a 60 on an exam, I'll just give you a C on that exam. Okay. Think about the selection issue that you would have. The adverse selection is people would hear about my grade policy and students would sign up for my class. And who has the most to gain from signing up for my class if I'm offering this grade insurance? The students who know they're going to do poorly, right? The students who think they're not good students. So that would be the adverse selection, okay? It's about who chooses to be involved. So that's one outcome. A second problem is something called moral hazard. Okay, so if you have asymmetric information, you might have adverse selection. You might also have moral hazard, and in many cases you'll have both. Okay, so for moral hazard, this is not about who is choosing to be involved. This is not about what customers you get. It's about how the customers change their behavior. All right, so recognize this is going to be after a transaction is created. One party will change their behavior in a way that harms the other party. Okay? So again, this is no longer about the behavior that the individuals had to begin with. It's about how their behavior becomes different because of the transaction. In this case, the transaction itself is incentivizing people to do exactly what the other party doesn't want them to do. Okay? So for moral hazard, it turns out health insurance has this too. All right, in regards to health insurance, think about the moral hazard. For example, imagine if you had really good health insurance. All right, imagine you had health insurance that's going to cover all of your medical expenses. Would that change your behavior? I know sometimes it's kind of hard to imagine that it does, but the research again and again shows that indeed it does change your behavior. So in regards to health insurance, the result is that people take more risks. All right, so you give people health insurance, they take more risks, and because they're taking more risk, they're more likely to need the medical expenses covered, right? So to give you an example, I once went a month without health insurance. It had to do with just one coverage ending and another one starting. And a friend called me up and said, "Do you want to go skiing?" And I said, "No, I don't want to go skiing because I don't have health insurance, right? And I'm not a very good skier. So if I get hurt, I'm going to have to pay for it out of pocket. It can be very expensive." So it's not that I'm necessarily a dangerous person. It's not an adverse selection problem, but it's moral hazard. Once you give me the health insurance, I take on more risks, okay? Seat belts do the same thing. Seat belts create moral hazard. You give people seat belts, they know that they have security. If they get in a wreck, that reduces the likelihood of them getting very injured, so they drive more dangerously. It's about how people change their behavior, okay? A second example here. Go back to that grade insurance. The adverse selection is about who takes my class. All right, so if I say, if you're going to get less than a 60 on my exam, I'm just going to give you a C on the exam, and I announce this to all my potential students. The adverse selection is I'm going to get students who don't really care taking my class. I'm going to get students that aren't very good taking my class. But there's also a moral hazard. If you ever get confused about the difference between these two, remember that adverse selection is about who chooses to be involved, and moral hazard is about how they change their behavior because of the way it's set up. All right? So the moral hazard here is that all students study less, or at least most, right?